The ambush began the way it always began, with silence, and the silence was the only warning salvage crew 9-4 ever got. Kale Voss had been counting their breathing for 6 minutes before he moved. 4 Ivrenn laborers and 1 Dominion overseer picking through the crushed nose section of a mining hauler that had died in this debris field the same week Kale's whole world had. And he let them get exactly as far as the cargo bay's spine, before he cut the tether that was holding a 40-ton chunk of hull plating in a lazy drift 11 meters above their heads. It came down without a sound in the vacuum, and by the time the overseer's suit lights swung up to track the shadow crossing his beam, Kale was already moving. Already inside the gap the falling plate had opened in their formation, and the only sound in anyone's helmet was the overseer's short, cut-off transmission before Kale's boarding spike went through the seam in his suit collar, where the armor plating always ran thin. 6 years in this field had taught him exactly where every kind of Imperial armor ran thin. A hunter drone came off the overseer's shoulder rig a half-second after its owner stopped transmitting. A fist-sized scout unit with a threading gait and a single red sensor eye. The kind of automated backup every overseer had started carrying after the 14th confirmed loss in this field. And Kale put it down with the flat of his boarding axe before its targeting cycle finished its first sweep. Because he had killed 11 of these exact units over 6 years and knew precisely how long their processors needed to lock a target. The 4 Ivrenn laborers scattered the way they always scattered, which was to say badly, clustering instead of spreading, because Ivrenn det crews trained for salvage work and not for combat, and Kale let 3 of them run. He always let the laborers run. It was the overseers he could not afford to let report back with a clean account, because a clean account meant Fleet Command revised its casualty models again. And revised casualty models meant more ships next time, and he had already buried what more ships had cost him once. He was hauling the overseer's beacon transponder out of the dead man's collar, the one piece of hardware worth the risk of lingering, when he heard the 4th laborer's suit alarm cycling through its emergency channel on an unencrypted frequency nobody bothered to secure anymore, because nobody expected the wreck field's ghost to be listening on channels meant for laborers instead of soldiers. He should have let it go. 6 years of staying alive had been built on exactly that discipline. Take the transponder, take the salvage, vanish back into the debris before the overseer's crew posted a distress call that would bring gunships. He had broken that discipline exactly never. Not for the first crew he'd ambushed with a boarding axe he'd built from a mining pick. Not for the crew after that. Not for the 11 salvage teams that had come in force 18 months ago with 3 armored escorts, and left with 2. Not for any of the 31 salvage runs the Empire had sent into this graveyard since the day it became a graveyard at all. He broke it now, because the alarm cycling through his helmet was a child's voice, thin and airless, and trying very hard not to sound like it was screaming. Larkspur Colony had been a farming and ore world 11 light-years off the nearest tribute lane, unremarkable enough that the Empire had left it alone for 3 generations, until a fleet registry survey found veins of raw duralite under the northern ridge rich enough to matter, and the colony's council had done the one thing fleet registry surveys never accounted for in their projections. They had refused the conscription labor writ that came with the survey, on the grounds that Larkspur's charter, 4 generations old and never once contested, said the colony's own people worked the colony's own ground. The Empire did not argue points of charter law with tribute worlds. It sent a pacification wing to argue instead, and when the colony's mining lasers, repurposed in 11 frantic hours into the only anti-orbital weapons a farming world had ever needed, put 3 of that wing's escort cruisers into this debris field before the wing's flagship finished the job from high orbit, the Empire stopped arguing entirely. Kale had been 17 years old, in a maintenance tunnel under the North Ridge fixing a coolant line with his father, when the sky over Larkspur turned white. He did not remember deciding to survive. He remembered his father's hand on the back of his neck, shoving him down a service shaft 2 seconds before the tunnel's upper levels came apart, and his father's voice, calm in a way that made no sense given what the ground was doing around them, telling him to keep moving and not look back at whatever the shaft's upper opening was doing to the light. He remembered 3 days of digging afterward, alone, through rock and cable and things that had been people, before he found the shaft's lower exit and climbed out into a silence that had not properly ended in 6 years. He did not go looking for his mother's grave, because there wasn't one. He did not go looking for his sister Wren's either, for the same reason. What Larkspur's fall had left behind, on the ground and in the debris field the Empire's own dead ships had joined in orbit, was the only grave any of them were ever going to get, and Cale had spent 6 years making sure the Empire paid rent on it every time it came back to strip the field for salvage. The first kill had not been a plan. It had been 8 months after the fall, when a scavenger cruise stray shot had put a hole through the last intact water reclaimer within 3 kilometers of the shelter he'd been living in, and Cale, 17 and starving and no longer entirely certain he wanted to survive the winter, had found the man responsible asleep in a drift pod and taken the reclaimer back with a mining pick before he'd fully decided to do it. He had not slept that night, or the next several, turning the fact of what he'd done over in his hands like a piece of wreckage he could not identify. By the 3rd crew, he had stopped losing sleep over it. By the 10th, he had a name he'd never asked for, one the surviving overseers of that operation apparently carried back with them, because the 11th crew arrived already calling this stretch of dead sky the Larkspur Ghost's ground, and the 12th crew after that had come with twice the escort and a bounty attached, and the name had simply never stopped growing after that. He followed the child's alarm through a collapsed cargo corridor in the hauler's aft section, past 2 more Ivrenn laborers he let scramble past him in the dark without so much as raising his weapon, because they were already running the right direction, away, and found the source of it wedged into a gap between 2 collapsed support struts, where a laborer half his size had gotten a suit tether snagged, and a hull fragment had come down across her lower leg hard enough to crack the suit's outer plating. She stopped screaming when the beam of his headlamp crossed her visor, and what he saw in her face, through cracked plating and frost already forming at the edges where her suit's seal was failing, was not the fear he expected. It was the particular, flat resignation of someone who had already done the arithmetic and reached the answer everyone in this field reached eventually, which was that nothing found by the Ghost of Larkspur walked away from the finding. Behind her, half buried under debris, a hand terminal was still cycling a message on repeat from Salvage Crew 94's command channel, the frequency wide open in the chaos of the ambush, and Cale read 3 lines of it while he knelt to check the crack in her plating, because the words on that screen told him something about this empire that 6 years of killing its overseers never had. Straggler recovery not authorized. Attrition acceptable understanding Order 7. Return to extraction vector immediately. The laborer's own crew, ordered by name and standing directive, had left her to die in the wreck rather than spend 90 seconds retrieving her. Cale Voss had killed 41 Imperial personnel in this graveyard over 6 years, and he had done every one of those killings without hesitating, because hesitation in this field was how the dead accumulated, and he had promised himself a long time ago that he would not become one more name on that list to save anyone's feelings, least of all his own. He looked at the girl's cracking suit seal, at the frost already crystallizing along the inside of her visor, at the standing order still cycling on the terminal behind her that had written her off before he ever arrived, and for the first time in 6 years, he did the thing his own discipline had never once permitted. He picked her up, instead of finishing what the standing order had already started. She fought him for the first 4 seconds, weakly, a small fist against his chest plate that had no force left behind it, and then her strength gave out entirely, and she went still in his arms in a way that terrified him more than the fighting had, because still, in a cracked suit losing pressure, meant a clock he could not stop by force of will alone. "Stay with me," he said, on a channel he'd kept dark for 6 years specifically so no one would ever hear his voice and put a name to the ghost, and broke that discipline too, because some disciplines were only worth keeping until the moment they cost more than they protected. He got her back through the collapsed corridor at a dead run, boots finding purchase against the hauler's tilted decking, through 6 years of muscle memory that did not need his conscious attention to navigate a wreck he had crossed 1,000 times, and he did not look back to see whether the retreating salvage crew had noticed one of their own was missing, because he already knew from the terminal's message that they had noticed and decided it did not matter. 40 light-years coreward, aboard the Dominion command carrier Ivrenn, Fleet Admiral Dorn Kesh stood over a casualty report from salvage crew 94's return shuttle and felt the specific, cold fatigue of a man reading the same failure for the 32nd time in 6 years, phrased in slightly different words. One overseer confirmed dead boarding spike trauma, consistent with the previous 30 incidents. His logistics officer read aloud, a narrow-faced Threll captain named Soren Val, who had drawn the misfortune of briefing this particular file more times than any officer in the sector command wanted on his record. One laborer unaccounted for, presumed lost understanding Order 7. Salvage yield, 0. Recovered material lost in the retreat, 2 hull-cutting rigs, 1 command transponder, 1 scout drone. 31, Kesh said. 31 incidents, Captain, not 30. I have read every one of them personally, because Fleet Command has made it exceptionally clear to me that a single human being holding an 11-kilometer debris field against the Dominion's own salvage operations for 6 consecutive years is not a curiosity anymore. It is an embarrassment with my name attached to it. He was not a cruel man. By the measures the fleet used to sort its officers, and he had spent 30 years earning a reputation for competence rather than spectacle, which was precisely why the file sitting open on his display now felt like a personal insult rather than a tactical problem. Larkspur's graveyard held duralite reserves worth a full sector's mining quota, sealed inside wrecks his own salvage doctrine insisted were routine recovery work, and for 6 years one human, a boy, according to the last visual confirmation on file, no older than 20 when the pacification wing's own gunnery logs had briefly caught him on a hull camera before he vanished back into the wreckage, had turned routine recovery work into the single worst-performing operation on Kesh's entire record. Standing Order 7 was my directive, Kesh said, mostly to himself, reading the line about the unaccounted laborer again. Attrition acceptable. I wrote that clause 18 months ago because I was tired of losing salvage windows to crews who wasted extraction time, retrieving stragglers from a field that kills anyone who lingers in it. I did not write it expecting to spend it on a child. Soren said nothing, because 30 years of service had taught him precisely when a fleet admiral's rhetorical question wanted an answer and when it wanted silence, and this, from the set of Kesh's jaw, was the second kind. 3 days later, the silence Kesh had been sitting in got a visitor he had not requested. Council Inspector Ve Marnasa arrived aboard a courier vessel with no advance notice beyond the arrival itself, which was, by the Council's own unspoken customs, precisely the point, and stood in Kesh's own command briefing room reading the Larkspur file's summary page, with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had already decided what she thought and was only confirming it. 6 years, Marnasa said, not looking up. 31 operations, 41 confirmed personnel losses against 0 confirmed kills on the target's side of the ledger. Admiral, I have reviewed failing commands before. I have rarely reviewed one this consistent. The target holds a defensible position inside terrain he has spent 6 years learning better than any officer I could send against him, Kesh said. Every operation I have run has treated this as a salvage problem. It is not a salvage problem. It is a siege, and I have been fighting it with recovery crews instead of a fleet." "Then fight it with a fleet," Marnassa said, closing the file. "The Council does not care how you close this, Admiral. It cares that it has been open 6 years, that the duralite under that field remains unclaimed, and that a sector-wide labor manifest now includes an unofficial hazard designation for the Larkspur graveyard that Ivrenn crews use to negotiate hardship pay. Do you understand what that means? Your failure has become a bargaining chip for indentured labor. It has become useful to people this Dominion does not answer to. That ends, Admiral, on a timeline I expect you to set within the week, or I will recommend Fleet Command set it for you." She left without waiting for a response, because Council inspectors did not require them, and Kesh stood alone afterward with the specific, cold understanding that 6 years of careful, incremental failure had just become a countdown with someone else's hand on the clock. He did not reach for the closure order first. Whatever shape Marnassa's ultimatum had implied, she expected his answer to take. 30 years of command had taught Kesh that the most expensive tool in a Fleet Admiral's arsenal was rarely the correct first tool, and 9 capital hulls committed to erasing 11 kilometers of debris were an expenditure the Council would remember on his record long after it had stopped mattering whether the operation actually succeeded. He had one option left that 6 years of salvage doctrine budgets had never once authorized him to spend, because its price per contract ran higher than an entire recovery operation's projected yield, and he authorized it now with the tight, deliberate reluctance of a man emptying the one account he had left before he was forced to empty the account that could not be refilled. "Get me a Skarn contract," he told Soren, an hour after Marnassa's courier had cleared the Reckoner's docking bay. "Reclamation grade, not bounty grade. I want a huntmaster who has run irregular combatants to ground on terrain worse than this one, and I want them aboard inside 72 hours, because I do not have longer than that to hand the Council something other than an authorization for total field denial." Soren's search returned a single name inside the hour, because there were not many Skarn huntmasters whose contracts carried the kind of guarantee Kesh needed, and Threx Orun's did. 17 years running irregulars to ground across a dozen contested systems, a completion rate the Skarn Reclamation Guild declined to publish, because publishing it would have made every other name on the roster look like an apprentice's, and a fee structure that assumed, correctly, that anyone hiring a Skarn huntmaster had already exhausted every cheaper option available to them. Threx Orun arrived aboard a lean, unmarked courier 31 hours later, alone in the boarding bay except for a 4-operative cadre traveling with them, and the specific, unhurried economy of movement that 6 years of studying his own overseer's deaths had taught Kesh to recognize as competence rather than showmanship, and read the Larkspur file's summary page in 11 minutes without asking a single question Soren had prepared an answer for. 31 operations, Threx said finally, closing the file with 2 long, jointed fingers, their voice carrying the flat, unplaceable cadence of a species that had learned trade standard as a 4th or 5th language rather than a 1st. "Every one of them run as a salvage security problem, Admiral. Your target has spent 6 years teaching every officer you have sent against him that this field is his ground and your people are the intrusion in it. You keep sending intrusions. I do not intend to be one." "Then what do you intend to be?" Kesh said. "Quieter than he is," Threx said, and left the briefing room to begin the only kind of preparation 17 years of successful contracts had taught them mattered, which was watching, for as long as the timeline allowed, before moving at all. Threx Orun's report reached Kesh 4 days later, transmitted from a recovery shuttle limping back to rendezvous coordinates with 2 of the 4-operative cadre dead and a 3rd carried out on a stretcher. And it was, in 17 years of Skarn Reclamation Guild contracts, the first report of Threx's career that did not end with a confirmed retrieval. "He is not what your file describes, Admiral," Threx said, over a channel scarred with the particular static of hardware that had taken damage it was not designed to survive. Your reports call him a survivor who kills anything that enters his ground. That is not incorrect as far as it goes. It is also not sufficient. I have run irregulars to ground on 11 worlds. None of them fought like a man defending only himself. He moved twice. In the 11 hours my cadre held contact. To protect a position, he did not need to protect if survival was the only calculation running in his head. I do not know what is inside that shelter with him, Admiral, but it is not nothing, and I am not confident total field denial solves a problem I do not yet understand the shape of. Are you telling me you failed the contract, Huntmaster, or are you telling me my target has a hostage? Kesh said. I am telling you I have never filed a report this uncertain in 17 years, and I do not intend to guess at the difference for you, Threx said. My cadre is withdrawing. The guild will refund the balance of the contract, per standard terms for an incomplete retrieval. I recommend against sending anything smaller than what you were already planning to send before you called me, because subtlety has now cost you 3 operatives and taught your target that subtlety is coming. He will not be caught by it twice. Draft the Larkspur closure, he said to Soren, the moment Threx's transmission ended, the decision arriving with none of the deliberation he usually gave an order of this size. Full deployment. 9 capital-class hulls, orbital bombardment authorization, total field denial. I am done sending salvage crews into that wreckage to be picked off one at a time by a legend that has cost me more personnel in 6 years than the pacification itself cost in 6 days. If the Council wants the Duralite, they can have it after the field is glass. If they want the human who has made a fool of my command for 6 consecutive years, they can watch the recovery drones sort his remains out of the slag. Sir, the reserves under the field are worth less to this command than my record is, Kesh said, and closed the file. 6 years, Captain. 6 years, and every plan I have sent into that debris field has come back lighter than it went in, and I have an inspector standing over my shoulder telling me my failure has become currency for people who owe this Dominion a debt they'll never finish paying. I am done being clever about this. Sometimes the correct response to a problem that will not stop costing you is simply more force than the problem can survive. He did not ask what would happen to any salvage crew still working the field when the Larkspur closure's first wave arrived, because in 18 months of writing standing orders that treated Ivrenn debt labor as an acceptable margin of loss, he had stopped considering that question worth asking out loud. Kale's shelter was a cargo module from a colony transport, buried under 6 years of debris and camouflage, netting deep enough inside the field's densest wreckage that no Imperial sensor sweep had ever flagged it as anything but more dead metal. And he got the Ivrenn girl through its airlock with 40 seconds of pressure margin left in her suit, and no clear idea, in that moment, of what he intended to do with her once she was breathing his air instead of dying in his arms. She came awake screaming, which he had expected, and then went quiet and rigid against the cot's restraints, which he had not, staring at him across the module's dim emergency, lighting with an expression that made him understand, more clearly than 6 years of Imperial casualty reports ever had, exactly what kind of thing the Empire's propaganda had told her he was. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, keeping his hands visible and his distance wide, the way you approached anything cornered and certain it was about to die. Your legs set, your suits patched, that's all that's happened here. They told us, she said, in accented but functional trade standard, her voice cracking on every third word. They told us the ghost skins what he catches, wears the plating like a trophy. That's why the overseers never let us near the wreck line alone. The overseers lied to you about a lot of things, I'd guess, Kale said. Standing Order 7, for instance. The part where your own crew left a message on an open channel telling you not to bother waiting for help. Something in her face changed at that, not disbelief, but the flat recognition of a person confirming a suspicion she had never been permitted to say aloud, and Cale understood, watching it happen, that this was not the first time this particular girl had been quietly written off by people who outranked her. Her name was Ivrenn, and the first 2 days taught Cale almost nothing except how carefully she watched the module's single airlock, tracking it the way a person tracked an exit they fully expected to need. On the 3rd day, a passive sweep drone drifted through the outer debris field on a slow orbital survey pattern, the kind Cale had learned to read from 3 kilometers out by the particular flicker of its running lights, and he killed every non-essential system in the shelter and pulled Ivrenn down beside him behind the module's reinforced spine. Both of them motionless in the dark for 11 minutes, while the drone scan swept twice across terrain directly above their heads and found nothing but more dead metal to report. She did not make a sound the entire 11 minutes, and when the drone's lights finally faded back into the wreckage beyond sensor range, she let out a breath that shook only slightly, and looked at him in the dark with something that was not quite trust yet but had stopped being pure terror. "You could have let that find me," she said. "Easier than explaining a second body in your shelter." "I could have let a lot of things find you," Cale said. "I've spent 6 years deciding what I let find me. I don't see why that changes now." The 5th day brought something the field's ambient drone traffic had never carried before. A stealth signature Cale's 20-year-old salvage-grade sensors nearly missed entirely. A heat bloom suppressed so tightly it read as barely more than thermal noise riding the wreckage's own residual warmth, moving through the debris in overlapping 2-and-2 cover with a patience no overseer search element had ever shown him in 6 years of watching them come and go. "That's not a salvage crew," Ivrenn said, reading the same faint returns over his shoulder, her voice gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet when she recognized something worse than she wanted to say out loud. "That's a hunting pattern. I've seen it in a training manual once, on a data slate I wasn't cleared to read. Skarn contract work. The Dominion doesn't send Skarn after salvage crews, Cale. It sends them after things it wants gone quietly." He counted 5 signatures inside the first 2 hours, moving in a slow, converging arc that would not intersect the shelter's outer camouflage for at least another 6 hours if their current heading held, which told him 2 things at once. That whoever had sent them understood this field better than any prior search element ever had, and that the 6 hours he had left were the only advantage 6 years of terrain knowledge still gave him over an enemy that had, for the first time, come hunting instead of stumbling. He did not run. Running inside a field, he knew better than any pursuer, meant surrendering the one advantage that had kept him alive across 31 prior operations, and he spent the next 4 hours doing what he had done to every overseer's crew since the first one. Reshaping the ground itself into a weapon, seeding 3 decoy heat sources through the wreckage's outer shell, collapsing 2 access corridors he judged the hunters would otherwise use to close distance too quickly, and moving Ivrenn, over her quiet, furious objection, into the shelter's deepest reinforced section, with the relay's spare charge pack and instructions that amounted, in substance, to "if I do not come back through that airlock inside 3 hours, you use what's in this room to survive without me. I'm not doing nothing while you go out there alone against people better at this than every crew you've beaten," she said, and there was nothing uncertain left in her voice by now, only the flat, stubborn conviction of someone who had decided her own survival was not worth purchasing with someone else's. "You said it yourself. You've spent 6 years deciding what finds you. Let me help decide this one." He did not have time to argue her out of it, and some part of him, 6 years starved of anyone worth arguing with at all, did not entirely want to, so he gave her the one job that used everything she actually knew and none of what she didn't. Monitoring the perimeter net's remaining sensors from the shelter's inner room and calling headings on an encrypted short-range channel only the 2 of them could hear, translating, in real time, whatever fragments of Skarn tactical chatter the net's passive receivers happened to catch. The engagement, when it came, was unlike any of the 31 that had come before it. The lead pair of hunters found the first decoy heat source within minutes and moved on it with a discipline that told Kale, watching from cover 80 meters out, that whoever had trained them had studied every one of his own 31 operations and built a doctrine specifically to counter it, spreading wide instead of clustering, checking overhead debris before crossing beneath it, refusing to commit more than 2 operatives to any single approach vector at once. He took the trailing pair with a collapsed strut rigged to look like structural failure rather than sabotage, the same trick that would fool Dask's element days later, and it worked exactly once, dropping one hunter under 6 tons of debris before the survivor's scream brought the rest of the cadre converging on his position at a speed no Overseer's crew had ever managed. 2 hunters closing on your position from the east ridge, 40 meters, Wren's voice said in his ear, steadier than he had any right to expect from someone who had been awake and terrified for 6 straight hours. There's a third moving to flank through the number 2 access corridor. Kale, that's the one you collapsed. They're cutting through the debris by hand. They know it's a trap and they're coming anyway. He met the huntmaster himself in the open scar of the hauler's crushed cargo bay, close enough to see, for the first time in 6 years, an opponent whose stance and breathing told him nothing was about to go the way it always went. Threx Orun fought the way Kale fought, using the wreckage instead of fighting through it, and the exchange that followed cost Kale a cracked rib and a shallow cut across his forearm that bled through his suit's undersleeve before he could seal it, and very nearly cost him the fight entirely when Threx's sidearm found the gap in his own armor plating that 6 years of killing Overseers had taught him to exploit in everyone else, and never once expected turned against himself. What saved him was not skill. It was Wren's voice in his ear, flat and urgent, calling a heading correction that put him half a step to the left of where Threx's second shot would otherwise have gone. A half step that meant the round took him across the ribs instead of through the collar seam, and in the half-second Threx spent recalibrating for a target that had moved somewhere their targeting cycle had not predicted. Kale closed the distance and put them down with the same mining pick that had killed 41 Imperial personnel before this one, though he stopped short of the killing stroke he had never once stopped short of before. Some instinct he did not have time to examine telling him that a huntmaster left alive to report back was, this once, worth more than a huntmaster's silence for good. Threx Orun did not fight the mercy. They lay in the wreckage's crushed decking with Kale's blade at their collar seam, and did the arithmetic of it in under 2 seconds, the specific calculation of a professional who understood exactly how close the exchange had run. You broke contact twice tonight to protect something behind you that wasn't your own life, Threx said, blood running dark along their jaw, their breathing controlled even with a blade at their throat. I have run men to ground on 11 worlds, human. None of them fought like that. I don't know what you're protecting in that shelter, and I find, against 17 years of professional habit, that I don't especially want to. Then don't find out, Kale said, and let them live, because 6 years of clean kills had taught him exactly how to end this, and 11 days of Wrenn Isval had taught him, for the first time, to ask whether ending it was the only option worth taking. Threx Orun withdrew with what remained of the cadre before dawn, carrying 2 dead, 1 wounded, and a report that would reach Fleet Admiral Dornkesh 4 days later, carrying more uncertainty than any Skarn huntmaster had filed against a single contract, in 17 years of never once failing to close one. Over the 11 days, it took her leg to heal enough to bear weight. 11 days Kale spent split between watching the field's perimeter for a follow-up sweep that never came and watching Wrenn with the wary attention of a man guarding a threat he could not yet categorize. He learned more about the Dominion's indenture compact than 6 years of killing its enforcers had ever taught him. The Ivrenn had rebelled against Dominion annexation 4 generations back, she told him, in the flat recitation of a history lesson drilled into every Ivrenn child before they were old enough to question it, and had lost badly enough that the compact written afterward bonded every Ivrenn born since into salvage and mining labor to pay down a debt the Dominion's own accountants had calculated once, a century and a half ago, and never once revised downward regardless of how much labor was extracted against it. Her older brother had died on a debris-clearing operation 2 systems over, in an accident the compact's terms classified as an operational loss rather than a death requiring compensation. Her mother worked a processing yard on the Ivrenn homeworld that Wren had not seen in 3 years, because leave time accrued against the debt at a rate that made visiting home a luxury priced beyond what a 19-year-old salvage laborer's wages could cover. On the 6th day, with her leg still splinted but the worst of the fever gone, she found the module's small workbench, and without being asked, began sorting the salvage parts Kale had stripped from dead hulls into piles organized by function, the quiet, competent habit of someone who had spent a working life around wreckage and did not know how to sit idle in a room full of it. She fixed, in an afternoon, a relay coupling on his perimeter sensor net that had been failing intermittently for 8 months, tracing the fault to a corroded junction Kale had checked a dozen times without finding, and when she handed the repaired unit back to him, she did it without comment, as if competence were simply the only currency she had left to offer, and she intended to spend it whether or not he asked for it. "You could have let me die," she said, on the 7th day, watching him clean a rifle he had built himself out of 3 different weapons pulled from 3 different wrecks. "The Ghost doesn't rescue Imperial crew. Everyone in the compact knows that story." "You're not Imperial crew," Kale said. "You're a debt the Empire never let you finish paying, doing labor you never agreed to, left to die by an order some admiral wrote to save himself the trouble of caring whether you lived." He set the rifle down and looked at her directly for the first time in days. "I spent 6 years killing everyone this field sent me because I couldn't tell the difference between the people giving those orders and the people just following them to stay alive. Turns out I still can. I just hadn't been given a reason to check." She did not answer that, not with words, but she stopped flinching when he crossed the module afterward, and on the 8th day, while she was testing weight against the far wall and wincing through it, she noticed the single object Kale kept in a sealed pouch beside his cot that was not a tool, a weapon, or salvage, and asked about it before she could stop herself. It was a child's hair clip, plain metal, tarnished from 6 years of storage but intact, the kind of ordinary object that survived catastrophe by accident rather than design. Kale did not put it away when she asked, which surprised him more than it surprised her. "My sister's," he said. "Wren, she was 11 when Larkspur fell. I found this in the tunnel 3 days after, in a section I'd already searched twice, and I've never been able to decide whether finding it the 3rd time was mercy or just bad luck." He turned it over once in his hand before setting it down between them, an offering he had not planned to make. "I don't talk about her. 6 years, and I think this is the first time I've said her name out loud to another person." "I had a brother," Wren said, after a silence long enough that Kale thought she might not answer at all. "Tessin. He was assigned to a debris-clearing operation before I was old enough to work a manifest myself, and the report that came back called it an operational loss, which is the phrase the compact uses when it doesn't want to pay a family anything for what it took from them. I was 12. I remember my mother reading that phrase off a terminal screen and not crying, because crying in front of a compact auditor gets flagged as instability, and instability gets your family's labor rating reviewed. She looked at the hair clip without touching it. "I don't think I've said his name out loud since the funeral we weren't allowed to hold properly, either." Neither of them reached for the clip again after that, but neither of them put it away, and it stayed on the small table between the cot and the workbench for the rest of the 11 days, an unremarked-upon witness to every conversation that followed it, the first thing either of them had set down in the open in years that was not built to be useful. Tell me about her, Ren said, 2 nights later, in the particular unguarded quiet that came after the shelter's systems cycled down for its low-power overnight rotation. Not how she died. I get enough of that in this field without asking for more. Tell me who she was before. Cale found, once he started, that he had more of it than 6 years of silence had led him believe. Ren teaching herself to read faster than the colony schoolhouse's pace by working ahead in borrowed texts. Ren arguing with their father about whether the North Ridge's ore veins ran deeper than the survey said. Ren's specific, stubborn insistence that the family garden's tomatoes were better than anyone else's on the block. An opinion she had defended with more conviction than most adults spent on things that actually mattered. He talked for longer than he had talked about anything in 6 years, and Ren listened the way she did everything, with quiet, complete attention. And by the 9th day she had started asking him questions of her own, careful ones at first, how he purified water, how he kept the shelter's heat signature below the field's ambient debris noise, how a 17-year-old boy with no military training had learned to kill Dominion overseers efficiently enough to survive 6 years of retaliation. And then, on the 10th day, a harder one, delivered while she was testing weight on her healing leg against the module's far wall. When this heals, she said, you could put me on the boundary marker and let a retrieval crew find me. Tell them I got separated, that I hid, that I don't know anything about you. That's the safe version of this. Why haven't you offered it? Cale had, in fact, considered exactly that version, more than once, in the small hours when 6 years of discipline argued loudly against every day. He let a stranger stay inside the one place in this field that had never once been found. Because the safe version assumes you take it, he said. And because I've spent 6 years being careful in ways that kept me alive and cost me everything else. I'm not in a hurry to go back to only being careful. She studied him for a long moment, the wary calculation of someone weighing whether an answer was truth or performance, and then, apparently satisfied, went back to testing her leg, and neither of them raised the boundary marker again. That same night nearly undid all of it. Cale's perimeter net lit at 3:30 with a return signature moving through the field's southern wrecks in a pattern too deliberate to be routine debris drift. A 6-person search element, lightly armed, moving in overlapping cover instead of the loose formation salvage crews used, and Cale recognized the discipline of it a full minute before he recognized, from the transponder codes bleeding off their suit rigs, whose crew it belonged to. That's my overseer, Ren said, reading the same codes over his shoulder with her face gone the particular still white of someone watching a debt come due. Coral Dask. He filed my loss understanding order 7-11 days ago. He has no operational reason to send a search element back into this field for a laborer he's already written off. She swallowed. Unless he's not looking for a body. Unless someone above him started asking whether I saw something on that data slate before I went missing, and he needs to know whether I'm still alive to have told anyone. Cale had killed search elements before, 6 of them over 6 years, and every one of those kills had followed the same clean, practiced logic that had kept him alive this long. Engage before they engage you, leave nothing behind that could be traced, vanish. He watched Dask's element move methodically closer to the debris field's densest cluster, close enough now that their search pattern would cross within 40 meters of the shelter's outer camouflage inside the hour, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, the old logic pulling against a newer and far less comfortable calculation. Ren, beside him, tensed and silent, and clearly expecting him to reach for the rifle he'd built out of 3 dead men's weapons. If they find the shelter, she said quietly, they find me. And if Dask reports back that I'm alive and know what's on that slate, the compact doesn't write me off anymore. It erases me properly, and whoever's giving him his orders won't stop at me. Then they don't find the shelter, Cale said and moved. He did not kill Coral Dask's element. It was the first time in 6 years he had gone out to meet an armed Dominion search party with a plan that did not end in a body count, and it cost him more improvisation than any ambush he'd run before it. A diversion built out of a decoy heat signature, rigged from a scavenged suit heater, and left drifting in a derelict cargo pod 200 meters from the shelter. A collapsed access tunnel he brought down behind him with a charge sized to look like structural failure rather than sabotage. And 11 minutes of leading 6 armed searchers on a slow, deliberate chase through terrain he had spent 6 years learning, and they had spent one dangerous night discovering they did not understand at all. Dask's element found the decoy pod, found the ruined cargo it suggested, and reported back a probable debris strike consistent with a laborer lost to structural collapse rather than survival, and Kale watched them withdraw from a shadowed gap in a collapsed strut 40 meters from where Ivrenn sat frozen and silent in the shelter's dark, close enough that he could have ended all 6 of them without moving from where he stood. He came back through the airlock afterward with his hands shaking in a way 6 years of clean kills had never once left them. And Ivrenn, watching him strip out of a suit he'd nearly torn open twice in the last hour, understood something about him in that moment that 11 days of careful conversation had not quite managed to teach her. "You could have killed them," she said. "It would have been faster, safer even, if any of them made it back with a clean read on this position." "I know," Kale said. "I've spent 6 years choosing the fast, safe version of every night like that one. I wanted to see if I still knew how to choose something else." He sat down heavily on the cot across from her, the adrenaline finally draining out of him in a way that left him hollow rather than steady. "Turns out I did. Turns out I'm not sure yet what that means about the rest of it." Ivrenn did not answer that with words either, but she crossed the small space between them and sat beside him instead of across from him. And for the first time since the collapsed corridor 11 days earlier, neither of them treated the distance between a human the compact called a monster and an Ivrenn laborer it called expendable as a thing that needed guarding. 2 systems away, aboard the salvage transport Varen's Det, laborer Eo Kresh checked the manifest clock for the 9th time in an hour, and did the arithmetic he did every time his crew drew a rotation into the Larkspur field. The same arithmetic every Ivrenn on the roster ran privately and never said aloud. 11 kilometers of debris, 31 prior operations, 41 confirmed dead, and a standing order 7 that meant if his crew's luck ran out the way 11 other crews' luck had run out before them, the manifest would list him as an acceptable loss, and his family's debt balance would not move an inch for the labor he had already spent paying against it. He had 2 daughters on the homeworld processing yard, a debt inherited from a grandfather who had died before Eo was born, and a rotation schedule that gave him exactly no say in whether this particular tour was the one that finally spent his life against a number that never got smaller. He did not know, checking the manifest clock a 10th time, that the fleet massing at the edge of the very field his crew was about to enter carried an authorization that made his own crew's survival, this time, entirely beside the point. On the 11th day, the field's perimeter sensors, a network of passive tripwires Kale had built and rebuilt across 6 years out of every scrap of working electronics the graveyard had ever yielded him, and which Ivrenn's repaired coupling had quietly made more reliable than it had been in months, lit with a return signature large enough that he checked the reading twice before he believed it. 9 capital-class hulls, holding formation at the edge of the debris field's outer marker, running full bombardment arrays instead of the small salvage escort patterns. He had learned to read at a glance over 6 years of watching this exact patch of sky. "That's not a salvage run," Ivrenn said, reading the same sensor board over his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her working life inside Dominion Fleet logistics even if she'd never been permitted to hold rank in it. "That's a field denial deployment, orbital strike configuration. I've seen the profile before, on a briefing screen I wasn't supposed to be reading." Her voice went flat in a way Kale was starting to recognize as her particular register for delivering bad news without letting it shake. "They're not coming to salvage the wreckage anymore, Kale. They're coming to erase it. And everything in it. Cale stood very still, watching 9 hulls hold position at the edge of a graveyard that held every remaining physical trace of his family, his colony, and 6 years of his own survival, and understood with the particular clarity of a man who had run every version of this calculation before that the Empire had finally decided the cheapest way to close his file was to remove the entire crime scene from existence, himself included. "There's still crews out there," Ivrenn said, before he could answer his own question, nodding toward the field's inner wrecks where 2 more salvage teams had been logged on the sensor net over the past 3 days. Stripped-down recovery details sent ahead of the main deployment to pull anything valuable before the bombardment made recovery moot. Standing Order 7 doesn't authorize extraction if it costs the schedule. If that fleet fires on its own timeline, those crews are still inside the blast radius when it happens. "That's not my problem," Cale said, and heard how thin it sounded even as he said it, because 6 years of survival had trained him to say exactly that sentence about every crew the Empire had ever sent into this field. And for 6 years it had been true, right up until 11 days ago, when a message on an open channel had made a liar out of every version of that discipline he still owned. Ivrenn did not argue with him. She simply looked at him, the way she had learned to look at people who had already decided something and were only pretending to still be deciding, and let the silence do the arguing instead. "How many?" Cale said finally. 2 crews confirmed on the sensor net. 6 to 8 laborers each plus overseers. Ivrenn's jaw tightened. All of them Ivrenn, on the labor manifests I used to see back when I still had clearance to read them. Standing Order 7 means none of them get pulled out ahead of a bombardment window, unless someone outside the chain of command tells them the window exists. Cale looked at the module's back wall, where a section of salvaged Imperial hardware sat under a tarp he had not pulled back in 4 years, because the device underneath it was the single most dangerous thing he owned, more dangerous than any weapon in the field. A long-range fleet relay transponder, stripped from the wreck of one of the Pacification Wing's own escort cruisers, fully functional, capable of broadcasting on any Dominion command frequency within 11 light-years, and capable, the instant he keyed it live, of telling every listening post in this sector exactly where the Ghost of Larkspur had been hiding for 6 years. He had kept it as a last resort for a scenario that never came, an emergency call he had promised himself he would make only if staying silent meant certain death and speaking meant a chance, however small, at something else. He had never once, in 4 years of owning that promise, imagined the emergency it applied to would belong to someone other than himself. "If I use that," he said, mostly to himself, "every ship in that fleet knows exactly where I am inside 4 seconds of the first transmission." "And if you don't," Ivrenn said, "every crew still out there dies not knowing there's a wall of fire coming, on the exact schedule an admiral wrote because retrieving them cost more than the schedule was worth." She limped closer, testing weight on the leg that had nearly killed her 11 days ago, and looked at the tarp, and then at him. "You already made this decision once, Cale. 11 days ago, in a corridor, for one laborer nobody would have blamed you for leaving. I'm not going to pretend I know what 6 years in this field cost you. But I know what silence costs, because I grew up inside a system built entirely out of it, and I am asking you not to let this be one more thing it takes." Cale Voss had spent 6 years believing the only mercy this graveyard would ever hold was the mercy of ending things quickly, and he stood now with his hand on a tarp that had not moved in 4 years, doing the same arithmetic he had done in a collapsed corridor 11 days earlier, and reached, this time without the 11 days of hesitation, the same answer. He pulled the tarp free. The relay's power core took 6 minutes to spin up. 6 minutes Cale spent running frequency scans to identify every channel the 2 stranded salvage crews might still be monitoring, and Ivrenn spent kneeling beside him, translating overseer shorthand off a data slate she had smuggled out of her own crew's wreckage 11 days ago without either of them noticing she'd taken it. A slate that carried, buried 3 folders deep, the Larkspur closure's full deployment schedule and its authorized bombardment window. 41 minutes from the moment the 9 capital hulls had first shown on Kale's sensor net. 35 minutes remained when the relay finished spinning up. Kale keyed the broadcast live on the open frequency Ivrenn identified as the salvage overseer's emergency channel, the same channel he had once refused to speak on for 6 years to protect a silence that had kept him alive, and heard his own voice go out across a graveyard that had never once heard it before. This is an open transmission to salvage crews inside the Larkspur debris field. Fleet Command has authorized total field denial in under 35 minutes. Standing Order 7 will not extract you before that window closes. This is not a Dominion channel. This is not a trick. Get your crews to the field's northern boundary marker now, or you will not be alive to hear the rest of this sentence. The silence that answered him lasted 4 seconds, long enough that he thought the channel had failed, and then a voice, E.O. Kresh's voice, though Kale would not learn the name until much later, young for an overseer's channel, Ivrenn accented, edged with the particular disbelief of someone who had spent a working life being told exactly what to expect from every direction, and had just been handed something outside every model they owned, came back thin and static-laced across the same frequency. Who is this? Someone who's been in this field longer than your admiral has been planning to burn it, Kale said. Move, now, northern marker. You have 30 minutes. Aboard the Ashvane Reckoner, Fleet Admiral Dorn Kesh was 3 minutes into reviewing final bombardment authorization when his communications officer interrupted with a report that took him a full 10 seconds to fully parse, because the sentence itself did not make sense against 6 years of intelligence he had personally reviewed on this target. Sir, we're reading an unauthorized transmission originating from inside the debris field. Dominion Standard Relay Hardware, encrypted origin, broadcasting on the salvage emergency band. The officer's voice carried the particular strain of someone delivering news his admiral was not going to like twice in one afternoon. It's warning our own recovery crews about the bombardment window, sir. By name. By exact time remaining. That's not possible, Kesh said, and heard, even as he said it, how much that sentence had come to define this entire 6-year file. No Dominion officer would leak an active operational timeline to Ivrenn labor crews. That signal has to be a corrupted echo of our own command traffic. Sir, the voice pattern isn't Dominion command cadence. Vocal analysis is flagging it as, the officer hesitated, checking a readout he clearly did not trust. Human, sir. Unregistered. The transmission origin coordinates are inside the debris field's deepest wreckage cluster. Kesh stood very still, understanding arriving in the specific, cold sequence of a man watching 6 years of careful casualty report language collapse into a single, unbearably simple fact. The Ghost of Larkspur, the human who had killed 41 of his personnel across 31 failed operations, who had never once in 6 years shown himself, spoken to anyone, or done a single thing that did not serve his own continued survival, had just broken 6 years of perfect silence to warn Imperial labor crews about a bombardment order Kesh himself had signed less than a day ago. Belay the strike window, he said, and heard his own voice come out strange, uncertain in a way it had not been in 30 years of command. Hold all 9 hulls. I want confirmation on those recovery crews' extraction status before a single shell leaves a single tube. Sir, Fleet Command's authorization specifically states total field denial regardless of. I am aware of what I authorized, Captain, Kesh said, sharper than he intended, because the sentence he had signed that morning, total field denial, regardless of crews still inside, was sitting in front of him now with a weight it had not carried when it was still an abstraction on a briefing slate. "Hold the window." "That is an order, and I will answer for it personally if Fleet Command objects." "Sir," said a second voice, younger, carrying the particular brittle confidence of a junior tactical officer who had spent the transit out memorizing the operation's original justification and had no intention of watching it dissolve without objection. Inspector Marnos's directive was explicit. Any delay past the authorized window requires her personal sign-off, and she is 4 days transit from this position. If we hold, and the Council asks why 9 hulls sat idle over a single unregistered transmission, then I will explain to the Council, personally, that I declined to glass an active extraction in progress because I did not yet understand what I was glassing, Kesh said, and the younger officer, reading something in the Admiral's face that had not been there an hour earlier, did not raise the objection again. On the field's northern boundary marker, Kale watched through a salvaged optic scope as 2 ragged lines of Ivrenn laborers came stumbling out of the wreckage in the exact directions he had guided them. 29 bodies in total by his count, dragging 2 injured between them, moving with the particular desperate speed of people who had spent their entire working lives being told their survival was a line item someone else decided the value of and had just, for the first time, been handed a warning instead of a write-off. He kept the relay live the entire time, narrating headings, correcting 2 crews who drifted toward a debris cluster his own 6 years of memory knew was unstable, and Wren knelt beside him the whole time reading Kesh's own deployment slate aloud, calling out the shrinking bombardment window in intervals neither of them needed a clock to feel. Halfway through the extraction, one overseer's voice broke onto the channel insisting the warning was a Dominion loyalty test designed to identify which crews would abandon their post without authorization, and held 6 laborers back at the wreck line arguing the point while the clock kept running, until E.O. Kresh, of all people, cut across him on the open channel and said flatly that he would rather be wrong about a test than right about a bombardment, and led those 6 out himself. 17 minutes into the extraction, E.O. Kresh's voice came back over the channel carrying a different kind of urgency, the flat, controlled panic of a man watching a plan come apart in real time. 2 of ours are pinned in the number 3 cargo spine. Collapsed decking, we can't shift it by hand, and the corridor therein doesn't lead anywhere but back toward the strike center. If we stop to dig them out, the whole group misses the window. Kale was already moving before Wren finished translating the coordinates. Cutting across 400 meters of wreckage, he could navigate with his eyes closed toward a corridor he had used as a bolt hole exactly once, 3 years earlier, and found 2 Ivrenn laborers exactly where E.O. had said, wedged beneath a collapsed support beam with 11 minutes left on a clock neither of them could see. He did not have tools built for this kind of extraction. He had a mining pick that had killed more Dominion overseers than he could number and wedged under the beam's leading edge, enough raw leverage in 6 years of hard labor to shift what 2 frightened laborers alone could not. The beam came free on the second attempt, and he had both of them moving, one slung over each shoulder, back toward the boundary marker with the clock still running and no breath left to spare for anything but the count. He was 300 meters from the boundary marker, lungs burning, 1 Ivrenn laborer slung across each shoulder, when a shape detached itself from the wreckage ahead of him, and he had the mining pick half raised before he recognized, in the same instant, the particular economy of movement that 6 years of killing had never taught anyone else to move with. Threx Orun did not raise a weapon. They stepped clear of the shadow they'd been standing in, favoring the side Kale's blade had opened days earlier, and reached for the laborer sagging across Kale's left shoulder without a word, taking the weight off him with the same flat efficiency they'd once used to hunt him. "I am still on contract, technically," Threx said, matching his pace toward the marker without being asked, "though the guild will tell you I withdrew from an incomplete retrieval, and my employer has since committed to a solution that makes my continued presence here professionally irrelevant. I remain to observe. I did not expect to spend the observation carrying cargo for the man I failed to kill. Why are you helping? Cale said, because 6 years of survival had never once given him time to ask a Skarn huntmaster anything, and some part of him needed the answer more than he needed the next 300 meters to pass in silence. Because I have spent 17 years being paid to end things I did not understand, and I find, watching this, that I finally understand one of them, Threx said. You are not what the file said you were. I do not know what that makes you instead, but it is not worth killing, and it was never going to be worth what my employer is about to spend proving it wrong. They crossed the boundary marker together, and Threx set the laborer down beside the others with the same unhurried care they'd carried him with, and were gone back into the wreckage before Cale could ask anything else, leaving nothing behind to prove they had ever been there except one fewer set of arms straining under a weight that had, for 300 meters, been easier to carry than it should have been. 9 minutes remained when the last laborer crossed the boundary marker into the relatively stable debris Shadow Cale had used himself for 6 years to survive close bombardment runs. And it was in that same window, with every crew accounted for, and the relay still broadcasting, that Cale made the second decision of the day that 6 years of discipline would once have forbidden him. He did not go dark. He stayed on the open channel, because 29 strangers who had just watched an enemy's warning save their lives were now staring at the source of that warning across an open frequency. And something in him, some part that 6 years of grief had buried but not killed, decided that a legend built entirely out of silence had earned, at least once, the right to be heard as something other than a monster. You're clear of the primary blast, Shadow, he said. Stay low, stay together. Whatever happens to that field in the next 9 minutes, it's not going to reach you there. Why? Eokresh said, quieter now, stripped of the disbelief and left with something closer to raw confusion. Everything we were ever told about you says you don't do this, says you don't warn, says you don't save anyone wearing a Dominion crew badge. Cale looked at Ivrenn, at the data slate in her hands still carrying the deployment schedule that had nearly killed her 11 days ago, at the tarp on the floor that had covered a last resort he had never expected to spend on anyone but himself. Everything you were told was written by the people who left you out there to die on a schedule, he said. I got tired of being the only lesson this field ever taught anyone. He cut the channel there, because the bombardment window was down to 6 minutes, and staying on an open frequency any longer was a risk even a broken discipline had limits on, and pulled Ivrenn back toward the shelter's deepest section, the one buried under enough wreckage to survive a strike that wasn't specifically targeted at their exact coordinates, and settled in to find out whether Fleet Admiral Dorn Kesh's 6-year patience had finally run out completely. It had not. The strike never came. Kesh held the Larkspur closure at the boundary of its own authorized window for 11 minutes past the scheduled strike time, watching 2 extraction shuttles confirm all 29 recovered laborers alive and clear of the field, and stood over a tactical display that no longer told him the simple story it had told him that morning. Sir, Soren Val said carefully, Fleet Command is requesting status on the bombardment authorization. They're asking why 9 capital hulls are holding position instead of executing. Kesh looked at the recovery confirmation on his display for a long moment, at 29 names that would have been logged as an acceptable attrition footnote if the day had gone the way he'd planned it that morning, and felt the specific, unwelcome clarity of a man realizing that the version of himself who had signed that authorization 18 hours ago had been operating on information a great deal simpler than the information he had now. Tell Fleet Command, he said, that I am not glassing an 11-kilometer field while an unregistered human combatant is actively coordinating the extraction of Dominion labor crews on an open channel, in direct contradiction of everything this command's own intelligence has spent 6 years insisting he would do. I want to understand what I am actually looking at before I burn the only evidence that might explain it. Sir, with respect, that's the target. 6 years of casualty reports. 6 years of casualty reports told me the Ghost of Larkspur kills anything wearing a Dominion badge that comes within reach, Kesh said. I have a recorded transmission, Captain, time-stamped and verified, of that same target guiding 29 Ivrenn laborers to safety ahead of a strike I ordered. At a cost to his own position, he had to know he was accepting the moment he opened that channel. Either 6 years of intelligence on this man is wrong, or something changed. I am not authorizing an erasure strike on a target I no longer understand, on the word of a report that has been wrong about him for 6 years running. The recorded transmission did not stay contained to Kesh's own command deck for long, because a Fleet Admiral holding a full field denial strike against direct council-level authorization was, by the standing procedures of Dominion oversight, an event that generated an automatic review file, and review files generated for irregular command decisions were, by a much older and far less official custom, exactly the kind of file that junior officers with access and grievances found their way into. Wren's own network reached it first, a labor relay chain built by generations of Ivrenn conscripts trading warnings and survival information across a compact that had never once granted them an official channel of their own, a system of smuggled data slates and borrowed frequencies that moved faster and more honestly across the sector than anything the Dominion's chorus propaganda feed ever managed. The recording of Kale's transmission reached 3 tribute worlds inside 2 days, stripped of official framing, carrying nothing but the raw audio of a legend built on silence choosing, once, to speak instead of kill. On the processing yard where Wren's mother still worked out a debt that had outlived 2 generations before her, the recording played on a borrowed hand terminal passed hand to hand through a work shift that should have been silent, and Wren's mother heard her daughter's name spoken aloud on the recording's ragged edge, Kale, mid-transmission, calling a heading correction to Wren's crew, second group, without thinking to strip the reference, and did not learn until 3 more days had passed. Through the same relay network, that her daughter was alive, and had been, however briefly, standing beside the very legend the compact had spent a generation teaching her to fear. Her name was Sela Isval, and she was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift sorting scrap alloy by hand when the recording reached her, and she did not stop working while she listened to it, because stopping in front of a compact line supervisor was its own kind of risk, regardless of what the audio playing through a smuggled earpiece happened to be telling her. She heard her daughter's name spoken by a stranger's voice in the middle of a warning about a bombardment window, and she kept sorting scrap with hands that had gone perfectly steady through 11 years of a debt that never shrank, because Sela Isval had buried a son to an operational loss classification 7 years earlier, and had promised herself, standing over a report she was never permitted to grieve properly, that she would not give the compact the satisfaction of watching her come apart over a second one. She finished the shift. She filed no complaint, requested no confirmation, asked no supervisor for anything the compact could flag and revise against her family's labor rating. She simply waited, the way 6 years of watching the compact write off everyone she loved had taught her to wait, until the relay network that moved faster and more honestly than anything the Dominion's chorus feed ever managed brought her, 3 days later, confirmation that her daughter was alive. What she did after that confirmation reached her, the relay network did not record in any official capacity. Because the relay network existed specifically to move things the compact was never meant to see. She began setting aside a fraction of her own ration allotment, water purification tablets, a spare relay coupling salvaged from a decommissioned processing line, medical stock skimmed carefully enough from inventory that no audit ever flagged the loss, and passed it, through 3 intermediary crews and a supply chain built entirely out of favors owed and debts of a kind the compact's ledgers had no column for. toward a boundary marker on the edge of a debris field 11 light-years from the yard where she worked. She did not know, sending that first parcel, whether it would ever reach anyone at all. She sent it anyway, because it was the only thing left inside a system built to take everything from her that she still had the power to give. On a frontier processing station 2 jumps further out, a crew of Ivrenn overseers who had spent years enforcing Standing Order 7, without ever questioning its arithmetic, listened to the recording twice in a locked break room and argued, quietly and for the first time in any of their careers, about what exactly they had been enforcing and why. And in a chorus regional relay office on a tribute world that had never once had reason to doubt the feed it broadcast, a young technician flagged the unofficial recording as it began surfacing in local data traffic, uncertain whether to report it up the chain or simply let it keep spreading, and chose, in the small, unremarkable way individual choices sometimes outrun entire systems, to do nothing at all. The recording reached the chorus feed itself 4 days after that, not because the Empire chose to broadcast it, but because Kesh's own review file, time-stamped, verified, unable to be quietly buried once 3 separate tribute worlds were already circulating unofficial copies, became, under the Dominion's own transparency doctrine for commandeer regularity reviews, a document the Council's Oversight Office was obligated to acknowledge existed. An acknowledgement that a legend the Empire had spent 6 years describing as an animal had instead, at the cost of his own exposure, saved 29 lives the Empire's own standing orders had already written off, was not a story the chorus could suppress without confirming it was suppressing something. And the chorus, whatever else it was built to do, had never been built to survive that particular kind of confirmation. Kale did not learn any of this until 9 days after the fact, when Wren, who had refused, after the extraction, to return to a compact that had left her to die on an open channel, and instead stayed in the shelter with a stubbornness Kale found he did not have the heart to argue against, pulled a data slate out of a supply cache that had appeared, unexplained, at the field's northern boundary marker 3 days running. "It's not Fleet Command," she said, reading the slate's contents with an expression Kale had not seen on her before, something between disbelief and a fragile, cautious hope. "It's Ivrenn crews, off-manifest supply drops. Water, medical stock, spare relay components, the kind of thing nobody logs on an official requisition because it isn't authorized." She looked up at him. "They're not hunting the ghost anymore, Kale. They're leaving supplies for him." Fleet Admiral Dorn Kesh stood before the Council's sector oversight panel 6 weeks later in a review chamber 3 levels below the Hall of Accord, a room built for exactly this purpose and stripped of every ornament that might soften what happened in it, and answered questions from 3 inspectors he had never met before that morning with the flat, careful precision of a man who had spent 30 years learning that panic in front of a review panel was its own confession. "You held an authorized field denial strike," said the panel's presiding inspector, an older Threll woman whose name Kesh had been given exactly once and did not expect to need again, "against explicit Council direction, on the strength of a single unregistered transmission from a combatant your own 6-year intelligence file described as uniformly hostile to Dominion personnel. Walk the panel through your reasoning, Admiral, because as written in your incident report, it does not obviously justify itself." "My reasoning, Inspector, was that 6 years of intelligence had just been proven wrong in real time, in a way that materially changed what I was ordering 9 capital hulls to destroy," Kesh said. "I had built the Larkspur closure around a single assumption, that the target inside that field was, and would remain, uniformly hostile to anything wearing Dominion markings. I watched that assumption fail on an open channel while 29 of my own labor personnel were still inside the blast radius. I did not consider it defensible to execute an order built on an assumption I had just watched collapse, regardless of what executing it on schedule would have cost me personally." "Inspector Marnos's directive specified a timeline," the presiding inspector said. You were aware, when you held that strike, that doing so placed you in direct non-compliance with her office. I was aware, Kesh said. I made the decision anyway, and I will not stand here and claim I made it lightly, or that I would have made it 18 months ago, before I wrote Standing Order 7 and told myself the arithmetic of it was simply the cost of an efficient operation. I have had 6 weeks to examine that arithmetic since, Inspector. I no longer believe it was efficient. I believe it was cheap, and I believe the 29 names on that recovery manifest are alive today, because a target I had spent 6 years failing to understand chose once to be something other than what my own reports insisted he was. Entered into the review's evidentiary record alongside the recording itself was a document none of the 3 inspectors had requested, and none of them could simply disregard once it existed. A Skarn Reclamation Guild liability disclosure, filed under the Guild's own strict independence requirements by a huntmaster named Threx Orun, stating for the permanent record that a contracted retrieval attempt against the Larkspur target had failed not for lack of skill, but because the target had, under direct engagement, broken combat contact twice to protect a third party at measurable cost to his own survival. A professional, disinterested assessment filed days before the recording ever existed, from a source with no reason to flatter a target who had nearly killed them. The Guild did not usually surrender its contractors' field reports to council review panels. Threx Orun, according to the brief cover note attached to the filing, had requested that this one be surrendered specifically. The panel deliberated for 11 minutes, a span of time Kesh spent standing exactly where he had been told to stand, and returned with a finding worded as carefully as 30 years of institutional caution could manage. But the substance of it was simple enough that even the chorus feed's most sanitized version could not fully bury the shape of it. Standing Order 7 was rescinded across the sector, effective immediately and retroactive to every open file it had ever governed. The Larkspur closure was permanently suspended pending further review of the graveyard's status. And Fleet Admiral Dorn Kesh was reassigned to a records archive, posting 3 ranks quieter than the command he had held that morning 9 weeks ago. A demotion the Council's official language called a reallocation of experience, and every officer who read the file understood as exactly what it was. Kesh did not appeal the finding. He filed his transfer paperwork within the week, and on his last night aboard the Ashvin Reckoner, alone in a command briefing room he would not enter again, he pulled up the recording one final time, Kale Voss's voice, thin and static-edged across an open channel, telling 29 strangers to move, because a wall of fire was coming whether or not anyone had warned them, and let it play to the end before he closed the file for good. Inspector Ve Marnasa, whose own directive had set the 6-day countdown that forced Kesh's hand, closed her copy of the final review without comment, and did not attach her name to any further correspondence on the Larkspur file, which was, in the particular grammar of council bureaucracy, as close to an admission as her office was ever likely to make. Kale Voss remained, 6 months later, exactly where he had remained for 6 years and a handful of months more. Inside the wreckage of a colony that had once been his whole world, in a shelter buried deep enough that no salvage crew came looking for it anymore, because no salvage crew came into the field looking for anything at all these days. The Duralite reserves under Larkspur's wreck sat where they had always sat, unclaimed, because the Council's suspended review had frozen every operation attached to the field pending an inquiry that showed no particular urgency to conclude, and the debris that had buried Kale's family and his colony and 6 years of his own grief had become, without anyone officially deciding it should, a place the Empire had simply stopped trying to take. He was not, by any measure that mattered, a different man than the one who had cut a tether 6 months ago and let 40 tons of hull plating fall in perfect silence onto an overseer's formation. He still checked the field's perimeter sensors every morning with the same discipline that had kept him alive for 6 years, still kept the relay's power core charged in case a warning needed sending again, still woke some nights with his father's hand on the back of his neck, and a sky gone white above a ridge that did not exist anymore except in the specific, unhealed geography of his own memory. But he was no longer, across an 11-kilometer graveyard and the handful of tribute worlds whose labor networks had carried an unofficial recording further and faster than any chorus broadcast ever managed. Only a story told to frighten conscripts into staying close to their overseers. He had become, instead, a story told a different way entirely. Quieter, stranger, harder to categorize. The kind of story that did not resolve into a clean moral so much as it sat, uncomfortable and specific, in the minds of every laborer who had grown up believing the Dominion's version of what a hardened, feared thing was permitted to be. E.O. Kresh, back on rotation 2 systems out, told the story of the northern boundary marker to a new crew of laborers exactly once, flatly, without embellishment, and then refused to tell it again, because he had decided in the weeks since that some stories were worth more kept than spent. On the evening, Ivrenn finally convinced him to sit outside the shelter's airlock instead of inside it, in a patch of debris shadow stable enough to risk an hour without a suit, watching the light of a system that was not their own catch on the drifting silver edges of a field that held everything either of them had left of home. She asked him the question he had spent 6 years assuming no one would ever care enough to ask. Do you regret it, breaking 6 years of silence for people who were never your responsibility? Cale thought about his sister Ivrenn, whose name he had given, without meaning to and without regret once he noticed he'd done it, to the girl now sitting beside him in every unguarded moment when he forgot to catch himself calling her something else entirely. He thought about a message cycling on an open channel that had told a 19-year-old laborer she was not worth 90 seconds of anyone's time, and about 35 minutes on a clock that had, for once, run out in someone's favor instead of against them. No, he said, I spent 6 years being exactly what this field needed me to be to survive it. Turns out that wasn't the only thing I still had left to be. Above them, scattered across the wreckage of a colony that the galaxy had once tried very hard to erase completely, the supply drops kept coming, unlogged and unofficial, 3 days out of every 7, from people who had never met him and would likely never learn his name, sent by crews who had decided, on the strength of 35 minutes and 29 lives, that whatever the Ghost of Larkspur actually was, it was not the thing they had spent their whole lives being warned about. The field held its silence again after that, the way it always had, but it was a different silence now, not the silence of a grave waiting to be stripped for parts, and not the silence of a legend built to keep the frightened at a distance, but something closer to the quiet that settles over a thing finally allowed to simply be what it is, standing watch over the dead it had never stopped grieving, no longer alone in doing it.